Well, Susan, that was fantastic. I've never been introduced quite that way. It was a little weird and very gratifying at the same time, but it was terrific. And thank you all for having me here, and thank you for this tremendous honor. It's really great to be here with you, and also to be with some colleagues of mine, former colleagues and current colleagues. Greg Moore, who was my colleague at the Boston Globe. Vince Bisdek, who was my colleague at the Washington Post. And my excellent current colleague, Kimberly Kindy. I want to congratulate all the winners of the Al Nakula Award. I think we lost that one this year, but I think it's fantastic. You did fantastic work, and I want to congratulate you on that. And I also want to congratulate all the winners of the scholarships. You are the future of our industry, and we need your talent, we need your creativity, we need your energy and your drive. And I especially want to thank Ashley for what she said about the Washington Post, and also what she said about the New York Times. Okay, so now, it's the Damon Runyon Award, but all of you must know that there's absolutely nothing Runyon-esque about me. Nothing I've ever written has been the basis for a Broadway musical. I've never been a big consumer of alcohol. I was drinking water all evening. Never a gambler, never a smoker. I don't drink 30 cups of coffee a day. And fortunately, I've never been fired, as Damon Runyon was, in 1906 from the Denver Post. Although, if I had been, I've learned tonight, I would have received a standing ovation like Dave Krieger. In any event, I'm very happy to be here with the Denver Press Club, where Damon Runyon spent so much of his time. And the sentiment behind this award is gratifying, that the journalism I've been associated with shed light on people who would otherwise not have their stories told, as David Milstead so kindly said in announcing it. And that is what I'd like to talk about here this evening, the stories we need to tell about the people whose stories otherwise would not be told. In the most recent presidential election, and since then, there has been a lot of talk about the forgotten men and women of America. During the current administration, it's been said, they're finally getting the attention they deserve. And it's also been said that we in the press are largely responsible for forgetting them. That, I would argue, is a myth, even if we have been far from perfect. Long before Donald Trump spoke of the forgotten men and women of America, the American press had been reporting on the concerns of regular people, their struggles, their aspirations, how they've too often been abused and exploited, ignored, and dismissed. I'll come back to that. But first I have to say what I've said many times before. It is true that we did not do a good enough job in the years before Donald Trump announced his candidacy to take the measure of the American public, to understand how so many felt dispossessed, abandoned by politicians, ignored by government. We failed to understand the depth of anxiety and grievance and how it could yield a candidate such as Donald Trump. We should have sensed it coming. At many news organizations, including the Washington Post, we have vowed to be more alert. We are determined to do better, to consistently report from every corner of this country, to give voice to people who are too infrequently heard. That includes Trump supporters, but many others too. The biography of Damon Runyon on the Denver Press Club website highlights how he was drawn to write about people who had been rendered invisible and whose worlds had gone unexplored. When he covered sports, he focused on the people who played, promoted, and attended the games rather than the games themselves. And he was inevitably led to the nightclubs, betting parlors, and other favorite hangouts they frequented. Today, we too can do more exploring. If instinctively we are drawn toward the people who speak loudly and wield power, we will have to self-correct by ensuring that those who speak softly or fear speaking at all get the attention they deserve. Today, the press is routinely portrayed as a class of people who do not listen, who do not empathize, who are incapable of empathizing with ordinary people because we are members of an elite. Not infrequently, the people drawing this picture of us are billionaires or multimillionaires, some, like the president, born into wealth and privilege. Whether or not they are the ideal critics, in an age of populism, this caricature of journalists shows unmistakable signs of sticking. We've seen caricatures like this elsewhere, in our own hemisphere even. We've seen it, for example, in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolás Maduro. A Venezuelan economist, now living in Madrid, wrote about the phenomenon for Post readers in January of last year. Populism, wrote Andrés Miguel Rondón, can survive only amid polarization. It works through the unending vilification of a cartoonish enemy. Never forget that you're the enemy. What makes you the enemy? It's very simple to a populist. If you're not a victim, you're a culprit. We can be angry over what is said about us. We can take offense. But the answer for us as journalists, I believe, cannot be indignation. And certainly it cannot be contempt, or even perceived as such. Having learned from what he witnessed in Venezuela, Rondón wrote, "Don't feed polarization, disarm it." This means leaving the theater of injured decency behind. Rondón wrote how Venezuelans fell into a trap in a bad way in the face of Chavismo. He wrote again and again, we wrote again and again about principles, about separation of powers, civil liberties, the role of military and politics, corruption, and economic policy. What was most needed, he said, was to actually go to the slums and the countryside, not for a speech or a rally, but for a game of dominoes or to dance salsa, to show they were Venezuelans too, that they weren't just dour scolds, and could hit a baseball, could tell a joke that landed, that they could break the tribal divide, come down off the billboards, and show that they were real. This is not populism by other means, he wrote. It is the only way of establishing your standing. It's deciding not to live in an echo chamber. Free yourself, he advised, of the shackles of the caricature the populists have drawn of you. The truth is that the journalists of our newsrooms do not fit the caricature being imposed on us. Our colleagues come from varied backgrounds. They bring a range of perspectives. So it's important, now more than ever, that we talk about who we are and the everyday work we do to bring attention to the pressures and concerns of all Americans. And it's important that we dedicate ourselves to that work, fully commit to it, and that we continue to staff our newsrooms with people who, because of their disparate lives, know what it means to grow up in different corners of America, what it means to immigrate here, to work here, to raise a family here, and also know what it means to fight the country's wars. Let me talk a bit about the people in the newsroom of the Washington Post, because they are like the people in your own newsrooms. Alex Horton. Alex Horton is a reporter on our general assignment desk. He graduated from Georgetown University, where he transferred from a community college assisted financially by the GI Bill. Before that, he was serving as an infantryman in Iraq with the 3rd Stryker Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division. His unit encountered some of the heaviest fighting during the 2007 surge in Baghdad and Diyala province. I asked Alex to tell me about his experience and how it contributed to his work as a journalist, and also to relate the circumstances that led to his Army Commendation Medal with valor, something he doesn't tend to discuss. I served for just under 4 years after high school, most of it in unremarkable training, Alex wrote me. The greatest value was probably the exposure to people from all walks of life. That was a useful experience for my future career. My enlistment culminated in a 15-month tour in Iraq. In one IED strike, a soldier lost his leg, another soldier's leg shredded underneath him, and their 22-ton vehicle was blasted so high it corkscrewed in the air and landed on its side. We commandeered a house and went to the roof. One house appeared to have movement, and we assessed it was a group of militants preparing to flank us. Another soldier and I stood up and fired grenades into the open doorway until the movement stopped. It was a somewhat tricky shot. At about 150 meters, firing a grenade into a doorway was like throwing an M&M into a coffee cup from across the room. An Iraqi soldier later said he counted more than a dozen dead, with weapons strewn about, though a helicopter also fired a missile at the building. The moment led to an Army Commendation Medal with valor, but it was embarrassing to be recognized for something almost everyone had done in some form: destroy the enemy and keep each other safe. That was essentially the job description. Alex notes that the Commendation Medal itself is common, but the Valor Device edition is not. And yet still, Alex says, it's not a huge deal in the grand scheme. He talks about how his service helped him become a better reporter. I faced a common challenge in college when I left the Army: alienation among younger students and a balancing effort between a course load, adult responsibilities, and reconciling combat trauma that unspools in quieter civilian life. That also means I knew the right questions to ask when I profiled student veterans for a story at The Atlantic while I was a student myself. And they trusted me to get it right. But that doesn't mean I pull punches or go easy on the institution that raised me. If anything, the mystery of the military has been stripped away, and I have developed the art of pushing back on officials who often hope reporters get lost in technical details. Sometimes when you don't have time to develop trust, it can sometimes be the edge in getting a story, or not. One example comes to mind, he said. I was assigned to cover the National Guard response to Hurricane Harvey, a few hours from my hometown of Dallas. I wore a Texas A&M hat to talk up football with people I encountered, and landed with an Army unit at first skeptical to escort a reporter. "Have you done anything like this?" one soldier asked before a long search mission. I responded, "Yeah, I was an 11 Bravo, so I've been on Redcon 2 waiting to SP. Translation, I was once an infantryman, so I have often stood by vehicles waiting to leave." The group laughed and relaxed after that. It turned out one of the soldiers was in the same part of Iraq I was in, so we traded old stories to get a new one. Salwan Georges. About a year ago, we hired Salwan as a photographer. Prior to joining the Post, he had gained recognition for a project about thousands of Iraqi refugees who had settled in Dearborn, Michigan, since the Iraq War. It was a subject of particular interest to Salwan. He was among the Iraqi refugees who had settled in the area with his family. 2 years ago, at age 24 and an honors student, he picked up his journalism degree at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. Salwan was born in Baghdad during the first Gulf War. He told a student journalist around the time of his college graduation that his earliest childhood memories were of looking out his window at bombs in the distance, thinking they were fireworks. When he was 8, his family fled to a monastery in Syria, in Damascus. As a refugee, he could not attend school. Instead, he worked among olive trees. In 2004, he and his family were allowed to come to the United States. When they arrived, his uncle offered advice that he took to heart. Salwan recounted to the student journalist how his father, who had no chance to go to college, told him, "Make sure to learn, it can change our life." Those words changed my life. And when he came to the United States, Salwan said his English skills were non-existent. I didn't even know yes and no. That's how bad it was. He aims to tell stories about those at the margins of society. Some people, he told that student journalist, act like they've been here forever, but we're all visitors here. We're all in the same boat. I want people to understand that it's the same for my people as it was for theirs when their families came here. Tracy Grant. Tracy is a managing editor at the Post. She oversees our hiring, staff development, and standards. Her Irish immigrant parents came to Chicago with $200 in their pockets. Her father worked as a hotel waiter, then as a day laborer, then at a job filling cans in a soda factory, then finally at a union job as a helper on a beer truck. Some months ago, I asked Tracy to tell me about the life they led. It was, she said, as blue collar could be. Literally, I would iron his blue shirts. He was an incredibly smart man who read voraciously and would have loved college if he had had a chance to go. I think a lot about my mom and dad when I read some of the stories about families in Middle America. My parents made a life for themselves and their daughters against odds that many people are facing today. But the jobs that my dad did are largely jobs that are going away. And so it goes in our staff. Lori Montgomery, our deputy national editor, grew up on a farm in western Pennsylvania. Her brother still runs it. Teresa Vargas, a writer on our local enterprise team who was recently named a Metro columnist, grew up in a low-income neighborhood in San Antonio afflicted by gang violence. One of our healthcare reporters, Paige Winfield Cunningham, is the oldest of 12 kids. She was homeschooled and then went off to Wheaton College, which is rooted in evangelical Christianity. Josh Dawsey, one of our White House reporters, grew up on a farm in South Carolina. When we hired him, I heard from an editor who remembered him as an intern in his home state. One day, his former editor recalled, he brought a bushel of fresh off-the-stalk corn from his family's farm into the office and offered everybody an ear. I told him the next day it was the best corn I'd ever eaten, and it was. And at the end of his internship, his parents came to pick him up. In they walked with a whole bushel of corn, all for me. People like those who've lived very different lives enrich our newsrooms. They help tell the stories of those who otherwise would not be heard or not be fully understood. It was the photography of Craig Walker of the Denver Post that helped readers understand the struggles of returning war veterans. And it was the feature writing of Jim Sheeler of the Rocky Mountain News that allowed readers to empathize with a Marine colonel whose job, with no training, was to notify families of the loss of their loved ones, to comfort them, and help however he could. It was Dave Phillips of the Gazette in Colorado Springs, whose investigative series revealed how soldiers were being discharged without benefits, often for minor offenses that were likely linked to combat-related traumatic brain injuries or PTSD. That is why we need vibrant local journalism. Work like that is at risk when a Rocky Mountain News closes and when the news staff of the Denver Post is cut and cut as it is being cut again today sharply. A community is at risk when the stories of its people are not told because there is no one to tell them. Civic life, suffers. The best owners of media know that at the heart of our business is a mission. The future of journalism, our profession and our business, requires that we fulfill it. I join all of you in the hope that journalism in Denver has such a future. Your colleagues around the country admire how you are fighting for it. Every year at news organizations of every size and of every type, in every city and every town, journalists commit themselves to the sort of work that Craig Walker, Jim Sheeler, and Dave Phillips delivered to this region and to this country. Over the past year, NPR and ProPublica collaborated to explore why so many American women were dying in pregnancy or in childbirth. The Asbury Park Press in New Jersey investigated the squalid conditions of renters whose landlords were receiving taxpayer-funded subsidies. The Washington Post traveled the country last year to listen to children who had fallen victim to gunfire or had witnessed it, documenting their severe trauma. Reporting by the New York Times and New Yorker on sexual harassment of women in media, entertainment, and elsewhere ignited a national and international movement. Reporters began by listening to women who had kept silent or whose efforts to speak up never received an adequate hearing. The Washington Post reporting on a woman who alleged she was assaulted by Alabama's Republican Senate candidate, Roy Moore, when she was 14 and he was in his early 30s, also highlighted the overwhelming burdens for women who seek to speak openly and honestly about such experiences. The Post reporter, Stephanie McCrummen, last month reflected on that woman and others who said they were pursued by Moore when they were teens and he was nearly twice their age. The women spoke up, she said, quote, without knowing whether they would be believed or if anyone would care, not knowing what the consequences might be for them personally, whether they might lose jobs or something worse. They did so knowing that their allegations were likely to upset some very powerful people. These were not people with money or power or influence. They were scared. They were people who were going to have to live with the consequences of their decision in small-town Alabama, surrounded by people who supported this candidate, including their own childhood friends and relatives. So really, Stephanie said, they had every reason not to come forward, including that we're at a point where people are being told you can't trust journalists. But they did come forward. That's pretty stunning if you think about it, Stephanie said. They came forward because they wanted the truth out there. And once they did come forward, it still wasn't over because many of these women were viciously harassed and threatened. They faced a barrage of attempts to undermine their credibility. And they never backed down. So that's pretty incredible to think about, Stephanie said. Women like those in Alabama, so often rendered invisible and inaudible, attacked if they dare speak up, are not the sort of forgotten people the president tends to mention. But we as journalists must listen, and we must allow the public to listen too. The benefits of listening, deep listening, listening patiently and with empathy, are twofold, as New York Times columnist Tom Friedman points out. The first is what you learn. The second, even more important, is what you say. In truly listening, you say respect. Which brings me to those who were victimized by clergy in the Catholic Church. When it came to listening to the survivors of sex abuse by priests, we as a profession could have done better and could have done it sooner. But when we did it right and did it with the thoroughness required, when we applied our reporting skills to disclose a decades-long cover-up that had allowed priests to abuse again and again, when we did all that, we made a difference. An enduring one, I hope. in the church and in other institutions too. There are two moments in the aftermath of the Boston Globe's investigation that stand out for me. One was a letter received well after the Globe published its first story on the church's pattern of concealing clergy sex abuse. It came from Father Thomas P. Doyle, who had waged a long, seemingly impossible battle within the church on behalf of abuse victims. And he wrote this: "The nightmare would have gone on and on were it not for you and the Globe staff. As one who has been deeply involved in fighting for justice for the victims and survivors for many years, I thank you with every part of my being. I assure you," he wrote, "that what you and the Globe have done for the victims, the church, and society cannot be adequately measured. It is momentous, and its good effects will reverberate for decades." I kept Father Doyle's letter on my desk in Boston, a reminder of our mission as journalists. The second memory for me was from a little over 2 years ago, during a screening of the movie Spotlight at my alma mater, Lehigh University. During the Q&A session, a man rose to the microphone to speak. "It was a very hard movie for me to watch," he said. "I tried to see it a couple of times. I only got to the parking lot and turned around. I'm 80+ years old. I was sexually abused by a priest in 1947. I was 11. I live with it every day. I was fatherless. I didn't know if anybody would believe me. I never spoke about it. My wife passed away many years ago. She never knew about it. It was in 47 he molested me, and he was ordained in 1947. Not a day goes by," he said, "that I don't have to live with this. I never spoke about it, like I said. Thank you, till it broke in Boston, and then I started talking about it. I do go to therapy," he continued. "I took my children with me, so they do understand, and they fully support me, and I thank you very much." I think about that gentleman when I hear our president say, "The press is the enemy of the American people." He did not see us as the enemy. He saw us as an ally. Finally, he had one. Other survivors of abuse and their families and friends feel the same. And so do the many other Americans who have had journalists listen to them when no one else would, letting voices that were long stifled be heard, giving power to those who had none in the cause of fair treatment. The best answer to a president who denigrates the press, the most effective answer over the long run, is to continue that good work, and by listening generously to all people, do more of it. That work is at the very heart of who we are as journalists. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you again for this great honor.